Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for around the next 30 to 40 minutes for our Creating a More Proactive Service Desk webinar. So my name's Amy, and as usual, I am joined by my colleague Sam as well. But before I do start talking to you about the agenda for the session, I'm just going to remind you of some of the standard pointers for the webinar. So we are going to be taking questions throughout, which you can do over the question box, which is expandable and collapsible using the orange arrow on the GoToWebinar panel, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you do ask a question, but you do need to leave early, don't worry, because we can follow up with this over email at the end. We're also recording the session, which we'll send out and will be available over YouTube shortly afterwards as well. So often, some of the struggles that we hear about from our customers or just generally in the industry are about how you can be more proactive day to day. So this could be with regards to the reactivity of incidents and the jobs that could have been prevented, perhaps just being more proactive about staying on top of your contracts and customer changes, or even being more proactive just to be able to ensure a high level of customer satisfaction. So the questions that we have come across made us think that it's probably going to be useful for us to host a webinar to try and address some of the ways that organizations can think about taking steps to be more proactive and why it's actually a good idea to think about these tips in advance. So during this webinar, we're going to look at firstly why you should be thinking more proactively before looking at 6 key themes and tips that we would suggest to try and help improve the efficiency and proactivity in these areas. So we're going to break these sections down into knowledge, customer satisfaction, time saving, making the most out of your tool functionality-wise, compliancy, and then costs. We'll then look at some more overall benefits that we believe can be felt from taking these steps. So generally the webinar is aimed at anybody working in the service desk environment, so regardless of which tool you're actually using. But for those listeners that aren't actually Top Desk customers, just a prior warning that there will be a couple of examples illustrated using Top Desk or functionality that is available within our tool. So let's just kick off by looking at some of the reasons behind shifting to a more proactive approach. So I'm first going to look at a few examples of issues that we've seen at organizations or that customers have told us about before we move on to our suggestions of how you can actually combat these with those 6 key areas. So you might recognize some of these points that are on the screen. This is actually just quite a brief list of some of the complaints that could be counteracted with some proactivity steps or ones that we've definitely come across with our customers. But one of the main topics raised within proactivity is that of reactive versus proactive management. So a reactive attitude often leaves service desks feeling like they're firefighting incidents and can end up feeling a little bit overwhelmed by those tasks piling up that could have been avoided. Organizations often want to be able to get better at staying on top of monitoring their stats and performance. So this could be a compliance issue to ensure contracts don't lapse or unnecessarily automatically roll on, or even just being able to report on stats and customer feedback to highlight where performance could have been improved. Hannah actually recently did a webinar for us on problem management, which she then touched upon known errors and root causes. So without having steps in place to discover root causes and track major potential issues, or replacements even, it's hard to move away from a reactive mindset. If you did want to actually watch that webinar, that's also available on our YouTube playlist channel. And sometimes service desks are left a little bit surprised when they receive negative customer feedback or repeat questions about what services are actually offered. So without having a transparent relationship with customers, a clear selection of services available and access to knowledge, it does make it harder to start on the right foot with each interaction. So I'm sure you can already start thinking about why getting ahead of the game on some of these points could start bringing benefits to your company, especially if these are issues that you find yourself getting frustrated with day to day. So just in a moment, I'm going to pass you over to Sam, who's going to start giving some more specific tips on those areas to look at improving your service desk. But first, I'm just quickly going to highlight some of the basic benefits that can be seen. So proactivity helps take the stress out of that firefighting lifestyle. By having proactive steps in place to investigate and fully report or replace faulty assets, knowledge to support FAQs, and clear overviews of known major incidents, the number of reactive incidents and jobs can start to decrease. Not only will this free up time for your operators, but it can also help to reduce the costs associated with fixing things that needed attention through that ability to then catching these things earlier on. And having plans and schedules in place to review contracts as well as appointing somebody to oversee them can make it easier to work towards successful audits and compliancy. So with that just being a very basic overview as an introduction, we obviously want to be able to give you some more takeaway tips and ideas to implement in your organization. So I'm just going to hand you over to Sam, who's going to go through the first few of those areas which you can start looking at proactivity on your service desks.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I'm going to kick off with the first of the 6 key themes that we'll be talking through, and this is knowledge. Using internal knowledge is arguably one of the most effective ways of being proactive, but it does, of course, involve a little bit of effort. And however you use knowledge in your organisation, there's almost always scope for improvement. Perhaps it's actually a case of you don't know what you don't know. So what can you do? Well, we've recently put together a quick quiz that you can take to find out how advanced your knowledge management is, as well as a handy infographic. And I'm just going to pull those up for you now on the screen. So there's the quiz you can take right now, and please do note other PDF viewers are available, but this is just my one of choice. I won't go into too much detail about this as it's something you can do in your own time, but essentially, depending on the number of yes statements that you tick, we'll recommend what you can start doing to take your knowledge to the next level, and we'll give you some things to think about. And if I just move on to the next one, as briefly mentioned, knowledge management expert Hannah Price has recently been working closely alongside our marketing department to put together an infographic with handy hints in it that will give you some guidance on things that you may not have thought about, as well as pitfalls and how to avoid them. So that's just up on the screen there now. And just so you know, we'll be sending out both of these in our post-webinar email. So if you're looking to improve the proactivity of your knowledge use, you will have these documents to hand. I'll just hop back into the PowerPoint now. But aside from that, do you have a knowledge manager who can be in charge of all things knowledge related? This just needs to be someone that will take an active interest in the knowledge management process at your organisation to design a method that works well for you. Or if you already have a knowledge manager as you're a larger organisation or have more mature processes, would it be useful for you to set up a small team of knowledge experts? That way, there'll be more motivation and pressure to carry out regular knowledge reviews or to host knowledge sharing days. And we'll be talking more about appointing roles a bit later on in the webinar. And what's more, keep your knowledge simple. So don't convolute the content that you create or bemuse your end users. Otherwise, you'll end up losing them at the first hurdle. So make sure that Shift Left Left is given the best start it can have by keeping all of your self-service portal knowledge items and FAQs as easy to read as possible. And before you publish anything, have your end users read it and perhaps get them to try out some of the resolutions for themselves to see if they can follow your instructions. Finally, for this topic, content on knowledge management is always being added to our blog. You can read more by accessing the link on the screen, which will take you directly to the BPKM section of the blog. And I had a quick look on there just the other day, and 2 new articles have actually been written on this topic in just the last month. The second topic we'd like to cover is that of customer satisfaction. We've talked about this topic in the past as it's something we get asked about a lot. And admittedly, finding out how satisfied your customers are is being pretty proactive to start with. So you'll need to take things a step further if you want to be truly proactive in this sense. How can you therefore go above and beyond the normal practice of what would be expected from the service desk team? Well, how about aiming to answer people's questions before they get a chance to ask them? For example, you can monitor the most common categories and subcategories of your instance by running a report that tells you what these are and drill down into the results to discover the simple incidents that reoccur. Are these things that you could train your staff on when they start instead of waiting for them to ask the questions? For example, you may often get asked how to set up work emails on your mobile. By having members of the service desk train department managers who can then train their teams, you could save your support staff an abundance of requests about this, whilst also empowering your end users. And the end result? Improved customer satisfaction and fewer repeat tickets. We've also talked a lot about gathering feedback at the end of your incidents. But do you find that you don't get a lot of respondents? And what's the best way to get people to reply? Just to give you a prior warning, this point is a little bit top desk specific. So depending on your organisation and the flexibility you have in what you can present to your end users, you may want to create a dedicated give us some feedback tile on the front of your self-service portal that your users will see as soon as they log in with a form behind it? And how about publishing a news article on the side of your portal that prompts users to fill it in? So this news article could contain details of a competition you could be entered into if you complete the form, which will further tempt people to click on the tile. But make sure you make the most of the flexibility that the form designer has to offer, so keep your form short to guarantee those submissions. And you should then be well on your way to success. As a third point, all too often we focus on trying to improve what we do badly, but to get to the next level, we need to improve what we're already doing well. So aside from looking at the bad stuff, find out who your net promoters are and get them to tell you what it is you're good at. In TopDesk, you can use the 5-star feedback rating to gauge a sense of how well your customers feel you did at resolving their issues. However, it's very easy to just click to give a 5-star rating, and it doesn't require that much effort. So look at the people who go out of their way to give you a comment as part of their feedback too. Then invite these people to sit down and explain why they wrote what they did and to tell you what else it is that they feel you do well as well. You'll then have a good baseline idea of what you're good at, plus it should hopefully be a bit of a self-esteem boost for the team. Finally, we did a dedicated webinar on this topic last year if you do need more inspiration. Our head of consultancy, Sumit, talked you through the ways you can measure and make sense of your customer satisfaction. The webinar can be found on our YouTube webinars channel, and to get there, access the link on this slide and then head to the English webinars page. Often when we're at work, we can get trapped in a routine of doing things a certain way, and we get used to it, even if there could be a much quicker method we could use. And out of either laziness or stubbornness, of which I'm definitely guilty of the latter, we don't change what we're doing. However, I personally have recognised that I often don't know the best way of doing things, and I really should listen to my colleagues more. And this could be a good place for you to start saving time, especially if you work alone a lot. So could a quick chat with a few people save you some time and give you a better way of working? You never know, you may also save them some time by teaching them some of your tricks too. But of course, most of you listening today have come here looking for time-saving examples that relate either directly to IT service management, facilities management, or specifically to TopDesk. So I've included a few of those as well. The first of these is to reiterate that we now have duration reports available to switch on in TopDesk SaaS in the Labs feature, and most recently, duration distribution reports. These reports will inform you of how long your instance spend in a certain status or with a certain team to help you drill down to where your tickets are getting stuck. And if you listen to our webinars regularly, you will know that I'm a fan of the Blue Peter "here's one I made earlier" phrase. So you will not be disappointed when I tell you that I ran a duration distribution report when putting together the content for this webinar, and that can be found in the image on the screen right now. As you can see, you can currently choose to run the report based on the status of the incident or the operator group the incident has spent time with. And I've ran the report on the status for 2018, which of course only has the month of January in it at the moment. And you can see that calls registered spent most of their time in the to supplier status. That's the orange bar in this month. So effectively, this report lets you do some more investigative work in a clear overview as to where tickets are spending the most time. But in addition, do you use the time registration tab? Well, I'll recap what you can do with it when you're working in TopDesk. So if you're looking for a better way to track exactly what you've been working on and for how long, then start using this and encourage others to do so too. An added bonus of using this tab is that you'll have something to show your managers when they ask what it is you're busy doing. And it'll make you aware of how long you spend on what, to establish how you should prioritize your time, and to see if some simple incidents are just taking you far too long to resolve. Maybe you should find a faster way to fix certain things. But what are a few quick wins that you can do to get you saving little bits of time here and there, all of which will add up? Doing things like setting up pre-configured default text answers for things you write out in instance a lot. For example, I'm working on this and I'll get back to you shortly with an update. Will shave a good few seconds off when responding to people. Also, make sure you've created as many template email actions as you can in the system. For example, create different email templates for first line, second line, and partial calls. For more information in Top Desk, see the new email actions that you can set up. Now, some of these are shown on the image on the right-hand side of the slide, and that's within the action management functionality. And of course, don't forget about standard solutions. So using these to autofill the category, subcategory, priority, etc. of your instance will really save you a lot of time over the course of a week. However, please do make sure that you review all of the text in these emails and solutions regularly. Otherwise, if the content isn't up to date, this could cause you more trouble than it's worth. And as we've spoken about already, you could appoint ownership for this to someone who loves to proofread and check through the content. But aside from those quick wins, I'd like to talk you through an example of how our Top Desk support team went about undergoing a time-saving exercise. Now, the team in Holland actually had a really successful day last year where they aimed to reduce the number of tickets that were open in the department. During the day, the whole support team, as well as colleagues from other teams who wanted to be involved, like development or consultancy, were placed into 4 different teams with the aim of resolving as many incidents as they could. There was a competitive edge involved too, as the 4 teams were given points per ticket closed. And at the end of the day, they all had some food and a few beers to reflect on their achievements. And the results actually spoke for themselves. So here is a graph that shows the number of incidents in Top Desk support up until this day. And then the day that this was held is actually at the very right-hand side of the graph, where the arrow is pointing. And as you can see, the total number of incidents fell by about a half, which is pretty impressive stuff. And by dedicating just one day to this, it freed up time for people to then go about working on other things and meant that our support guys weren't firefighting new incoming calls anywhere near as much. But that's all from me for now, and I'm going to pass you back on to Amy, who will take you through the last 3 topics.
Great, thank you, Sam. So one of the key areas in being proactive about improving your service desk is actually to look at the tool you're using and ensure that it is being used to its full potential. It's easy to get complacent after implementing a tool with all the processes set up and ready to go and everything's new and shiny. But perhaps in time, your organizational needs change and evolve. Perhaps your services that you offer have grown, but the system doesn't always get updated to reflect this. So it's easy to lapse on keeping up to date, even with the basics such as categories and subcategories that are needed within the services in the tool. The more requests and tasks that then come in that don't fit within a specific category, the less relevant and accurate reporting will be, and then it's even harder to start tracing customer satisfaction. So it could be that you've created all of the services and forms in your self-service portal, but again, as the organization changes and perhaps the services offers grow to support different areas, the forms and tiles aren't as relevant anymore. So having someone keep on top of checking what information is published out can ensure a consistent level of customer service. So having regular reviews scheduled as part of someone's role is a simple way to make sure that this gets done. And if this does seem quite like an overfacing task to do yourself, Top Desk actually offer health checks, which are conducted by our consultants. So these are based on those values used in the initial implementations that work between the people, processes, and the tool. So the current state of your tool and the process being used within them will be assessed to see where you're up to. Is there anything that's changed and could be improved? As well as the people. So are your staff up to date on the functionality, or perhaps there's been a changeover of staff since the initial implementation? So there might now be a knowledge gap that could be filled with a bit of training. So once a health check has been done and areas of improvements are discovered, it's easier to set up more regular scheduled checks. So whether these are a recurring operational activity for auditing purposes, or you prefer to have a more ad hoc check-in every now and again when you feel like it could need reviewing, perhaps based on an organizational change. But if you are interested in finding a bit more about the health checks, then please do let us know either on the questions box or send us an email, and Sam and I will follow up with you after the webinar. But those on the view that are on continuous deployment will be well aware of the regular new releases of Top Desk features, and we have spoken about those new features in Top Desk Labs being available in previous webinars. But we would advise having someone that can keep an eye out and check the release notes for the new functionality to really ensure that your organizations can make the most out of this as and when it does become available. Some of the newer features, such as the report that Sam mentioned, could really help you keep on top of being more efficient as a service desk. But someone does need to keep tabs on this and relay the information and tips to the rest of the staff that will benefit, because otherwise it's just going to be left unused and you might end up being a step behind where you could be and perhaps where everyone else is, which isn't perhaps that proactive in itself. And if you do have a tool that's capable of setting predefined rules for assignment, communication, and more, then make sure you're actually taking advantage of it. Although it does take that little bit more time to set up in the beginning, it'll make life much easier for your operators, your engineers, and yourself by saving time and effort relating to those manual admin tasks. But all of these points can be tied together by having a person that's in charge of maintaining the system in line with the organization, the functionality available, and those planning ahead changes that could improve the service desk in the future. This is often the application manager, which actually might be yourself in this case. And I think Sam and I can safely say that you've been quite proactive by listening to this webinar in the first place and some of the other ones to learn a bit more about the tool. But perhaps your organization might warrant someone else to oversee this more directly if possible. If you can, try and find time to sit down perhaps after the webinar or soon after whilst it's fresh in your mind to jot down all of the areas that you would like to plan to continuously check or maintain to be more proactive in. This can then help you gauge if it's too much work for one person, or perhaps it's work that you aren't actually authorized to do yourself, so would need to get someone else involved. Most importantly, this is a continuous process. So it is all well and good reviewing the functionality and doing your system health check, but this needs to be scheduled and be a regular occurrence to identify and implement improvements. Otherwise, you'll end up 6 months, perhaps a year down the line, having to do everything all over again. A key part of the service desk is often managing contracts. So whether this is to assign jobs and calls that come in, to store these in a logical place, this is one of the key areas where if it's not properly monitored, an organization can start to slip up. So missing those contract expiries can't necessarily be something that can be fixed quickly because you might be able to risk failing an audit, but it's also an unnecessary cost. So Topdesk or other tools that do have contract management within them can try and help you avoid this, again through just making sure you are using the functionality to its full potential. There are different stages to managing contracts within Topdesk, and some people listening might have quite an extensive contract and SLA management process set up in Topdesk already. But if not, a simple start is to just store the contracts in Topdesk without necessarily assigning them to a service. So this might not seem to be as proactive as some of the next tips, but it's definitely a step in the right direction for those of you that currently have perhaps contracts saved in different areas or printed copies scattered around the office which are difficult to find and sort through or might even be in different locations. So not only can contracts be attached, but you can also start adding really useful information to each record. For example, once you've got your contracts in place, you might actually want to store them with expiry dates. It's easy to set up reminder alerts then using the inbuilt events and actions tool. So this allows for reminders to be sent out to the relevant people that can then review and possibly renew contracts that are due to expire. For example, we could have an email that's sent out to the contract manager a month before a contract's due to expire, or even more time if necessary, just to allow time for a review and possibly take any cancellation period into account. A key benefit of this is to ensure that those rolling contracts don't continue after they're no longer needed. So it's not uncommon that we hear in the industry or just in general that those rolling contracts actually get forgotten, and perhaps it's for an asset that you've actually replaced, but it never gets thought about that you need to cancel the contract as well. So quite often it's only ever picked up once a finance team gets hold of it and an invoice comes through. Another simple tip is to create a selection of contracts due to expire within a certain amount of time. This can be placed on the home page of the user who oversees these to allow easy access to the overview at any time. So the screenshot on the left just shows an example of a selection that you might want to have stored on your home page. But once this has been selected, it can also be set up to prompt the user to define the selection that it wants to be viewed based on the time until a contract will expire, which can be seen on the image on the right-hand side. So most organizations have regulations to comply with and contracts that go alongside with their compliancy. By having these contracts monitored with scheduled checks and reviews, it makes it easier to comply with these certain regulations. More importantly, if contracts in place are linked to services, it helps to ensure that the service provided in each instant can then again be in line with the relevant regulations. So once a contract or SLA has been applied to a ticket, the information available to the user who's actually undertaking the resolution, it helps them make it easier to work towards the standards required. This also makes it easier for the staff, who then don't have to spend time finding the relevant contracts or information for the standards, and it also takes away that risk of human error. Both of these then make it easier to start working towards better and faster response and resolution times. So to help this, utilize the ability to simply attach the relevant certificates or compliancy or standards to the relevant contracts and tickets. This may seem like quite a small enhancement, but it really helps to have all that information accessible in the same place. And again, as with other areas that we have mentioned, it really helps to have someone in place that oversees contract management, who can then monitor the success of the proactive steps and make any changes where necessary. So for our last theme, we're going to look at costs, and I think it's safe to say that all organisations are concerned with being efficient and savvy when it does come to costs. So as I did mention on the last slide, it's important to be proactive with areas such as contracts to make sure that money isn't being spent on redundant contracts and assets. But what about keeping on top of your suppliers too? So how many times have you had unexpected price rises or discovered that you could be spending less elsewhere? Try and include supplier reviews in your schedule reviews as well, because it is just general good practice to scope out the market from time to time. So even if it's not to save costs, but just to make sure you are still using the best and most relevant supplier for the task at hand. A really important task to do in any organization is to schedule maintenance on assets. So whether this is something IT specific, like with a server, or perhaps more facility specific with a boiler, not only is this sometimes a safety concern, but it also helps to be proactive before the asset actually comes to the end of life, as well as being able to get it before something goes drastically wrong that could have been flagged up and spotted in advance. This will hopefully then save some quite hefty replacement costs. This again also ties back to our initial discussion about reducing the number of reactive tickets that the service desk has to deal with, as well as just being able to stay compliant. So much like ensuring contract information is in place and accessible, Topdesk also caters for lots of different areas that you can store cost information across the system. So try thinking about ensuring all of your assets are inputted with purchasing, residual cost, or other key information within them. This will really help save time should an asset need to be replaced if the information is already there, with a history of this as well. This also then applies to those that are using property management within Topdesk. So it's really helpful to have those costs in the relevant places, such as against the specific branches or room cards before they're needed, and again to be able to have a history of where all these costs have been placed. And often it's easy to miss cost updates on the self-service portal. So are you using order management, or do you have any cost information on the self-service portal? If you do, then make sure that this is up to date at all times as well. It's really easy to forget about updating information like this on a portal when you have made those changes internally. So without having the up-to-date prices, if the costs do rise, you might then risk having to provide the lower costs anyway, as these are the ones that you've advertised out on your portal. If not, you're still risking upsetting your customers by surprising with the higher costs after they've already placed their request. And similarly, if you are using reservations management, it's equally as important to check that costs applied to adding services, such as your catering services, are up to date. And do these still actually reflect the suppliers that you're using? And finally, try and be proactive in looking into reports. Reports are really valuable in the information that can be pulled for them, and even just a simple list of recently logged calls could show something like repetitive in the calls coming in certain assets. Now, is this because of an asset that needs replacing, or perhaps customers have not been provided with correct training or information? So either one's going to provide wasted costs, because we're either looking at costs that could be spent fixing an asset over time that could have been replaced in the first place, or we're looking at the costs of sending operators and engineers for repeat tasks that could have been solved with a knowledge article or training in the first place. But alongside those 6 themes we've spoken about, I'm going to pass you back to Sam, who's just going to wrap up the webinar with a few of the general benefits and some conclusions from us.
Yeah, so if you take all of these things into consideration, then you should start to reap the following overall benefits. Firstly, the better delegation of work. So by giving specific responsibilities to members of the service desk, people will know exactly what is expected of them and what they're in charge of. You'll also know who to speak to if you need help with something, so you won't need to go around the houses looking for an expert in, for example, customer satisfaction. Secondly, on the whole, the service desk team should have more free time to dedicate to being able to work on second or third line incidents. And it will also leave more time for things like their personal development or being able to get involved in projects, something which is highly encouraged at Top Desk. Amy and I know that to do with webinars. Or maybe your team have had small things they've wanted to fix or improve for a while, but they just never seem to get a minute. If everyone has a couple of these things, it would be worth them having just a little extra free time to work on them. And make sure all content and the use of the tool will be universal and consistent. So this is a lot more important than people realize, as the consistency of how you use your service management software will really count towards the professionalism of both how the service desk comes across and your organization as a whole. So next time you go to write in an incident, think about the effect what your writing could have on your company. If you don't already have one in place, it may be worth putting together a list of guidelines as to how to respond to your customers or end users. Obviously, this stuff isn't rocket science, but it's good to be reminded once in a while that a little does go a long way. And finally, you can prove that you've made improvements. So use reporting and build these to your advantage. Think about the cost reports that Amy just mentioned, as well as ones that show you how your operator's time is distributed. And if you're feeling really brave, you could have one or two of these automatically sent to your manager at the end of the month. But aside from those overall benefits, I'll now briefly recap everything that we've talked about today for you. So make sure that you are thinking about the 6 key themes we discussed individually. Break them down and tackle them one at a time. Don't run before you can walk, as they say. Maybe start by focusing on the theme that best fits the primary reason that you would like to become more proactive and start there. And appoint the roles that we talked about, such as a contract manager or someone in charge of compliance or knowledge, and somebody working on customer satisfaction, and emphasize the responsibility that comes alongside taking on these roles. As I've written on the slide, some changes will be fast, but others could take a lot of time and effort. If you're looking to make fast changes, think about the quick wins that I mentioned in terms of time saving. However, undertaking something like a customer satisfaction campaign could take you anywhere from 6 months to carry out, followed by even longer to start seeing the results. So be patient. Finally, you can make the most of your tool by simply exploring the software available to you and finding out things you didn't know you could do. You may well discover that there are other reports you can run or things like tabs within the software that you didn't know existed. And that's that. Well, on behalf of both myself and Amy, thank you very much for listening to us today. We will now stick around, as always, to answer any questions that you might have. And remember, the webinar will be uploaded to YouTube shortly, or if you would like it to be sent to you in a different format, please just let one of us know. Our emails are up on the screen there now. And if you did sign up for the webinar or you're listening live, then expect the knowledge management content we talked about heading straight to your inbox. Well, that's all from us. Thank you again.